Hello everyone, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy's Smarter Insights into Mains Answer Writing program. And in today's class, we'll be having some important questions which are asked in General Studies Paper 3 of UPSC Mains Examination. And one by one, we'll be discussing all these questions and answers in a detailed and in-depth manner, so that we'll be understanding the structure, presentation, content of the questions which are asked in the UPSC Mains Examination. And the first topic is a very important topic, and this topic is asked from the internal security portion of the UPSC Mains Examination syllabus of General Studies Paper 3. And in fact, this question is asking us about the terrorism. Now, in fact, terrorism is a very important topic, and in fact, UPSC has already asked about this topic in previous years also. Now, if we talk about terrorism, we all knew that it is a major global threat, right? So in this context, how has it manifested in India? And elaborate with contemporary examples, and what are the current measures adopted by the state, and you need to explain these measures adopted by the state. Now understand that the question has the component parts. So firstly, it says that terrorism is a global scourge, and how the terrorism is manifested in India in different forms. And this is the first part of the question. And in the second part of the question, you need to elaborate the global threat of terrorism and its manifestation in India with the contemporary examples. And then what countermeasures have been adopted by the state to deal with the scourge of terrorism. So you need to address three parts of this particular question. Now, in the model framework, in the introduction itself, you need to briefly introduce what is terrorism. We all knew that terrorism is a major threat to the national security, public safety around the world. And in fact, it is also a national security for India as well. Now, in the body part of the answer, you need to mention that how terrorism has manifested in different forms. Firstly, in the form of cross-border terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, left-wing extremism in several parts of India, insurgency in northeastern part of India. And even you could also mention the recent examples like Pahalgam terror attack. So once you are done with all these things, you need to mention the countermeasures adopted by the government. For example, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And it has also created the agencies like National Investigation Agency, and the developmental schemes that are being launched by the government, and international cooperation on this arena. For example, Financial Action Task Force. So therefore, you need to mention all these three parts in the answer with adequate data and examples. In the conclusion of this answer, you need to highlight the need to adopt a multi-pronged approach and how it is important and essential to achieve the lasting peace. This is how the model framework of the answer should look like. And in the introduction, as I have already told you, that you need to briefly introduce terrorism. Now, if you define terrorism, it is a violence adopted by the non-state actors. And the objective of the terrorism is to instill fear and also achieve political, ideological and religious goals. However, terrorism is a global concern. Like how climate change is a global concern, terrorism is also a global concern. However, if we talk about terrorism in the Indian context, it has manifested in multiple shapes. One is Islamist militancy, specifically in the state of Jammu and Kashmir, left-wing extremism, or it is also called as Naxalism, ethnic insurgencies in northeastern part of India, and separatist movements like Khalistani movement. So this is how terrorism has manifested into different forms. And then you need to talk about the manifestations of terrorism in India. Now, in the first part of the answer, you need to write about the Islamist or separatist militancy in Jammu and Kashmir and how it has been a major source of cross-border terrorism into India. So firstly, you need to talk about the Jammu and Kashmir and Islamist or separatist militancy. Now, for example, between 2014 and July 2024, the terror-related incidents have dropped from 7,217 to 2,263. And in fact, there is a major drop or decline in the civilian killings as well. The civilian killings fell to around 80% in the same period as well. The incidence of Islamist or separatist militancy has been on a decline. And you should also talk about the recent example of a terrorist attack which took place in Pahalgam on April 2025. Because this Pahalgam terror attack claimed 26 lives of tourists. And in fact, you need to talk about the Global Terrorism Index 2024 and India's rank in the Global Terrorism Index. This shows the vulnerability of India to the global terrorism. So, India facing Islamist, Sikh and even separatist and other terror groups as well. So therefore, India is one of the most vulnerable country for the terrorism. And next, you need to talk about the left-wing extremism or Naxalism and how it has been posing threat to country's security. However, if you look at the left-wing extremism, and it is mostly concentrated in the central part of India in states like Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, Odisha, parts of Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and Maharashtra. However, in recent times, the violence which is linked to the left-wing extremism has been reducing. However, despite there is a decline in violence created by the left-wing extremism, but it is still on a decline and it still persists in several places that I have just discussed. However, as per the 2024 assessment, civilians plus security forces fatalities in such violence were at historical low levels, because in the year 2023 it is reported that 61 civilians were killed. However, even though Naxalism or left-wing extremism still prevalent, the incidents remain, or it is still prevalent, still concentrated in the major portion of India. And then we need to talk about the ethnic separatism, ethnic violence or insurgency in the northeastern part of India. And in fact, in India, in states like Assam, Nagaland and Manipur and several other states, there are several insurgent groups as well. And these insurgent groups have been very often adopting the violent means or terror methods for fulfilling their political demands. For example, the United Liberation Front of Assam, it remains still active. And apart from that, you need to talk about the other modes of terrorism. For example, proxy war tactics, urban terrorism, lone wolf or self-radicalized modules, or you can also write or add sleeper cells as well. They are being influenced by the terrorist ideology. Now, in fact, the terror landscape of India, so it includes attacks in urban areas, particularly the Mumbai blast can be an example. And Secunderabad blast in the year 2012 is also another example. Most of these terror attacks are proxy supported and even the cross-border operations. And these terror attacks are emerging self-radicalized modules. Right, so these are the different methods, or this is how terrorism has sophisticated in India or manifested in India. And then you need to briefly talk about the countermeasures adopted by the state to deal with the threat of terrorism. So first, you need to write about the legal and institutional measures which are established to deal with the terrorism. The government has enacted laws like Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, which is also known as UAPA. And in fact, this Unlawful Activities Prevention Act designate the terrorist organizations and prevent detention. It provides for the preventive detention of individuals who are arrested on the charges of promoting terrorism as a part of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. And in fact, in the year 2018, National Investigation Agency has also been established as a central counter-terrorism agency. However, in the year 2024, if you look at the facts, it has achieved 100% conviction rate in around 25 special NIA court cases. And in fact, total 68 convictions, 210 arrests, and assets worth of 19.57 crore attached by the National Investigation Agency. So these are some instruments which are part of the legal or institutional frameworks aimed to deal with the threat of terrorism in India. And then you need to talk about the operational measures and intelligence enhancement. And in recent times, the intelligence agencies or improved coordination among all the intelligence agencies and tighter border fencing, a strict whistle on terror financing through the Financial Action Task Force, and we also have the Money Laundering Act of 2002. So therefore there is a strict vigil on terror financing and tighter border fencing, particularly cross-border terrorism from Pakistan to India, and a better collaboration and coordination between the central and state intelligence agencies have been yielding the positive results. In Jammu and Kashmir, there are measures like attachment or freezing of properties, blocking of benefits to persons who are linked to terror, and this has helped reduce the incidence of terrorism. For example, the reduction of jihadist attacks by 87% in the year 2023 as per the National Crime Records Bureau's data. So therefore, these measures have been yielding the positive results when it comes to countering terrorism. And apart from that, in order to deal with the left-wing extremism and insurgency in the northeastern part of India, the government has also adopted a set of developmental and governance initiatives. And in fact, the developmental and governance initiatives aimed at recognizing the alienation and deprivation and how the elevation and deprivation have been fueling the existing extremism. So therefore, the state has started adopting the developmental means in these affected regions. For example, the left-wing extremist areas, the government has started the Aspirations District program. So apart from Aspirations District program, the government has been taking steps to connectivity and also improve the living standards of the people. And Ekalavya model residential schools in tribal areas is also another method of increasing literacy rates in these tribal areas. And in the border districts, the Vibrant Villages program has been launched by the government to improve the connectivity and improve the development. And apart from that, there are several livelihood development programs, skill development programs have also been launched by the government as part of its larger developmental and governance initiatives. And then we need to talk about the international and diplomatic posture, because terrorism is a global threat and international coordination is very important in this context. And in fact, India has been recently decided or speeded up its diplomacy to highlight the state-sponsored terrorism, particularly from Pakistan, because Pakistan has been promoting the cross-border terrorism and Pakistan has been sponsoring terrorism from decades. So therefore, India has engaged in multilateral forums. India pursued the cross-border strikes operations when it is needed. Operation Sindoor is also one example of the cross-border strikes which targeted the terrorist establishments. So this is how you have to address the core demand of the answer. So once you have addressed the core demand of the answer, you need to write a good conclusion. Make sure the conclusion is positive and optimistic in nature, and that will help you score good marks. Now in the conclusion, you just mentioned that terrorism is in India manifested in multiple forms. As we have discussed all the multiple forms of terrorism. However, the terrorism has been exploiting the different fault lines which are existed in society and the geography. So therefore, in this context, the government should launch a multi-pronged legal, operational, developmental and diplomatic means to deal with the scourge of terrorism. However, a significant progress has been achieved in dealing with the terrorism in recent times, because there has been a substantial decline in the incidents and fatalities which are caused by the terrorist attacks. However, the challenge is far from over because there are emerging threats like self-radicalization, cyber-terrorism, and hybrid tactics of terrorism. So therefore, in this context, it is very important to start or launch a multi-pronged approach which looks at the legal, operational, and developmental diplomatic objectives to deal with the terrorism. Right? I hope you have understood how the answer should be framed for this question. And next also there is another question which deals with the left-wing extremism, and this is also from the internal security portion of UPSC Mains General Studies paper 3 syllabus. And if you look at the question asks that Government of India recently stated that left-wing extremism will be eliminated by the year 2026. By the year 2026, left-wing extremism will be completely eliminated. Now, in this context, what do you understand by left-wing extremism? How are the people affected by it? And what measures have been taken by the government to eliminate the left-wing extremism? Right? So, this is the question. Now, firstly, you need to understand and also identify the component parts in the answer, right? So the government has recently stated left-wing extremism will be eliminated by 2026. So this is just a statement. Now, what do you understand by left-wing extremism? And how are the people affected by the left-wing extremism, and what measures have been taken by the government to eliminate left-wing extremism in India? Now, firstly, you need to introduce left-wing extremism in the answer. Now, what exactly is a left-wing extremism? It is an armed insurgency which is driven by the Maoist ideology. And in fact, left-wing extremism aimed to overthrow the democratic state. And then we need to talk about the body part of the answer. Now, in the body part of the answer, it affects the tribal communities through violence, displacement, and disrupted development. And then you need to mention what is the government's response to the left-wing extremism, and what measures that the government has been undertaken so far to deal with the problem of left-wing extremism. So this is how in the body part of the answer you need to mention all component parts of the question. And then in the conclusion of this answer, you just emphasize on the need for a balanced approach when it comes to combating the left-wing extremism and also achieving inclusive development in the areas which are affected by the problem of left-wing extremism. Now, in the introduction of this answer, what you have to write? So, introduction, you briefly write about the left-wing extremism, or you define left-wing extremism, which is also called as Naxalism. Now, Naxalism or left-wing extremism is a violent insurgency, and this violent insurgency is founded on the Marxist or Maoist ideology. And in fact, the left-wing extremism or Naxalism primarily targets the Indian state from the hinterland or remote areas. And in fact, it has emerged as a socio-economic protest movement several decades back, but over a period of time it has grown into an internal security threat by exploiting the governance vacuums and the social deprivation of the existing society, or the social deprivation of people who are living in these remote tribal areas. So this is how you have to briefly define the left-wing extremism. And then you need to draw the map of India, and in this map of India you should also show the areas which are affected by the problem of left-wing extremism. For example, so these are the areas which are affected by the problem of left-wing extremism. So you have to highlight this. You should also draw a map as well. So that will make your answer more and more impactful. And then in the body part of the answer, you just mention what is left-wing extremism. Now, as I've already defined left-wing extremism, so left-wing extremism is a violent insurgency, and they are influenced by the ideology of the Marxist or Maoist ideology. and in fact it is primarily led by the Communist Party of India, Maoist. And apart from the Communist Party of India, Maoist, and it is also associated with several other groups, and all these groups have drawn their inspiration from the Maoist ideology. So therefore they have been advocating for the protracted people's war against the state. So they wanted to overthrow the state with the violent means. And then we need to talk about the geographical spread, and the area that have already shown to you through the map. That area is known as the Red Corridor, the area where the left-wing extremist movement is still prevalent or concentrated, and that area is known as Red Corridor. And in fact the Red Corridor primarily concentrated in tribal and forested areas with a weak governance structure. For example, there are some states where this left-wing extremism is still prevalent, and the Red Corridor is mostly concentrated in these areas. For example, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Maharashtra, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Telangana, among others. So these are the states. In these states, the Red Corridor is still prevalent. Now, what are the characteristics of left-wing extremist movement or the Naxalite movement? Now, in fact, the characteristics including armed attacks on security forces, ambushes, and use of improvised explosive devices, extortion. Extortion means taxation of contractors and the companies. For example, if any contractor executing any work in the tribal area or area in the Red Corridor, they have to pay a certain amount of money to the left-wing extremist groups, which is known as the extortion. And then disruption of state services, infrastructure, and the recruitment of the marginalized youth belong to the tribal areas or within the Red Corridor. So these are some characteristics or characteristic features of left-wing extremism. And then we'll understand how people are affected by the left-wing extremism. So it also has number of dimensions as well. So first we'll understand how people are easily affected by left-wing extremism. So firstly, it has security and human cost, because violence very often results in loss of civilian and security force lives. For example, deaths in left-wing extremist movement or left-wing extremism areas dropped significantly over the past few years. And apart from that, the displacement of the tribal people, tribal communities, owing to crossfire, coercion by extremists, and the militarized operations. Right? So then we need to talk about the developmental impediments because of the left-wing extremism. So left-wing extremism also affecting the development in the tribal areas. Left-wing extremism has been disrupting the basic infrastructure in the tribal belts or tribal areas. For example, education, healthcare, telecom services, connectivity. These facilities are hardly provided in the left-wing extremist areas, because whenever the government tries to make a road to improve connectivity to the tribal areas, the Maoists or the left-wing extremist groups very often explode those roads. They explode the school buildings and even the hospitals as well. So they make sure that the government has not influence the mindsets of the people. So therefore roads, telecom, education, health services, they gets delayed or they even blocked as well. For example, many schools in these tribal belts or red corridors, they remain non-functional, they remain closed. And apart from that, economic deprivation is also another major problem that people have been facing in these red corridors. Because of industrial and mining projects, they often stalled or forced to divert resources to security rather than growth. So therefore, it will affect the local livelihoods as well. And then they also establish parallel governance structures and they start exploiting the people as well. Right? So the extremist groups very often known to establish this shadow administration. They levy illegal taxes, extortion, and they even obstruct the democratic institutions and their functioning and even the local governance institutions as well. Now, what measures have been taken by the government so far to eliminate the left-wing extremism? Now, in fact, left-wing extremism is a major threat that India has been facing. So therefore, in order to deal with left-wing extremism, there is a need for a multi-pronged approach that looks after security, development, and governance. So security needs to be taken care of. Governance should also be given adequate preference or priority, and then development should also be taken care of. So therefore, there is a need for a multi-pronged strategy which could keeps in mind all these three things. Now, firstly, security and operational measures. The government has adopted, the Ministry of Home Affairs has announced the zero tolerance policy towards the left-wing extremist violence. So because of this zero tolerance policy, the left-wing extremist violence has declined, because the government has adopted the ruthless approach and coordinated operations under Operation Samadhan. Right, so Operation Samadhan has been launched by the Ministry of Home Affairs to deal with the left-wing extremist problem. And apart from that, the affected areas or the red corridors overall size has been reducing over a period of time, because from 12 most affected districts to 6 in the year 2025. By the year 2025, there are just 6 districts, most affected districts. So there is an overall drop from 126 districts in 2023 to much lesser in 2024. Right, so the government has adopted the security and operational measures, and they are yielding success when it comes to dealing with the problem of left-wing extremism. And then we should talk about the development and governance measures. So firstly, we should talk about the infrastructure and connectivity. As part of special central assistance and the security related expenditure, special infrastructure schemes, so all these schemes have been targeting the left-wing extremist affected areas, the most affected areas. So by merging all these programs, the government has been constructing roads. So around 13,000 plus kilometers of roads have been constructed in the most affected LWE areas, and around 2,300 plus mobile towers have been installed so far. And then we should also be talking about the welfare and inclusion measures that are being launched in the tribal belts. So as I've already told you that the aspirational districts program has been launched by the government. Ekalavya model residential schools have been launched. And apart from that, there are some number of programs which have been launched by the government. So these programs aim to integrate the tribal youth, enhance financial inclusion, skilling and livelihood alternatives for the people who are living in the most affected areas of LWE. So therefore, it will reduce the support base for the extremists, because extremists have been recruiting the tribal youth. Right, so tribal youth are the major force within the LWE. Now when government start launching all these measures, it will empower the tribal youth and it will cut down the source of LWE forces. And then the government has also adopted surrender rehabilitation and public participation programs, because as of now the underground cadres were given incentives to surrender and they could rejoin the mainstream as well. So around 801 surrenders and 742 laid down arms in one period as of 2024. Therefore, this is a massive success across all states. And apart from that, community engagement and intelligence is also another very effective means to deal with the left-wing extremist problem, because the security forces and the government have been encouraging the public cooperation, started toll-free numbers for the intelligence in states like Odisha, and reward schemes are also announced for the informers about the left-wing extremism. So therefore, the security forces can carry out targeted attacks against the Maoists. And in the conclusion of this answer, you need to write a very brief and impactful conclusion. So we have understood the problems of left-wing extremism and the measures that are being launched by the government to deal with the left-wing extremism. However, the problem of left-wing extremism is deeply rooted in existing socio-economic deprivation and the governance gaps. So therefore, we need to bridge the socio-economic differences or deprivation, and then we should also improve the governance architecture at the grassroots level, particularly areas worst affected by the left-wing extremism. However, it is certainly a positive news that there is a substantial decline in violence and the affected areas. So therefore, this shows the effectiveness of combined strategy of the security operations, developmental interventions, and the governance reform, which has been yielding the positive results so far. However, the government aimed to end left-wing extremism by the year 2026. So therefore, it actually hinges on the sustaining momentum in remaining core areas or in the red corridor. So therefore, it will ensure the last mile delivery of development, reinforcing trust with the local communities as well. So overall, there is a need for a multi-pronged strategy which includes development, governance, and also security. So that will yield the positive results when it comes to dealing with the left-wing extremist area. So next question is, explain how fiscal health index can be used as a tool for assessing fiscal performance of the states in India. In what way would it encourage the states to adopt prudent and sustainable fiscal policies? Now, in fact, this fiscal health index is launched by Niti Aayog. So Niti Aayog has launched this fiscal health index. The question is, explain how fiscal health index can be used as a tool for assessing the fiscal performance of states in India. In what way would it encourage the states to adopt a prudent and sustainable fiscal policies? And in the model framework of the answer, you just have to briefly introduce what is the fiscal health index, and it is a comprehensive tool or a composite tool to evaluate the fiscal performance of Indian states. Now, in the body part of the answer, you need to write the two components which are given in the answer. This is the first component and this is the second component. So you must mention two components given in the answer. Now, how it assesses the key indicators like revenue generation, debt levels, and expenditure quality. And then you need to talk about how it encourages states to adopt prudent and sustainable fiscal policies. And then in the conclusion of the answer, how fiscal health index encourages states to adopt prudent, transparent, sustainable fiscal policies through data-driven governance. So this is how you have to address the demand of the question. So make sure you identify the core theme of the question and you just address the core theme in the answer. Now, fiscal health index is an indicator which has been designed by Niti Aayog to assess the fiscal performance and sustainability of the Indian states. And the fiscal health index, it evaluates the fiscal strength of states across the key parameters such as revenue generation, expenditure equality, debt sustainability, and fiscal prudence. However, the fiscal health index, it serves as a diagnostic tool to encourage data-driven policymaking and financial discipline at the sub-national level. So this is how the fiscal health index will capture the comprehensive picture of fiscal health in states, right? So you can also go through the fiscal health index which is released by the Niti Aayog and performance of various states in the fiscal health index. Now let's understand how fiscal health index assesses the fiscal performance of states. So firstly, there will be a multi-dimensional indicators in the fiscal health index because it considers parameters like own tax revenue of the states, revenue deficits that they have, the capital outlay or capital expenditure, or debt to gross state domestic product ratio, and interest payments. So therefore, it is consisting of a multi-dimensional indicators because the RBI's state finances report and studies by the 15th Finance Commission. So they have used such metrics to evaluate states' fiscal positions. So in a similar way, the Fiscal Health Index of Niti Aayog has also looking into the multiple dimensions of states' finances and revenues. So therefore, there will be an accurate picture of it. And then we need to talk about the comparative analysis. Comparative analysis is also very important among different states within these dimensions that we have just discussed. So there will be interstate comparisons of their fiscal performance. And the Niti Aayog's Fiscal Health Index also highlights the best performers and the states which still lags behind in the performance. For example, southern states like Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, so they score better, they score well on fiscal prudence compared to fiscally stressed states like Punjab, Bihar and other states. And apart from that, it also monitors the time as well, because it helps track improvement and deterioration in the fiscal indicators over a period of time. So therefore, the Fiscal Health Index of Niti Aayog, so it also monitors or it also tracks the fiscal indicators of the states. Now, how the Fiscal Health Index is incentivizing the prudent fiscal policies, because it promotes competitive federalism among different states. So therefore, the states strive to improve their ranking and attract investments, and better central assistance will also be received by the states. And then it also informs the policy correction. For example, it identifies weak areas like high committed expenditure or low capital outlays. For example, Punjab's 48% debt to gross state domestic product, so which highlights states with a high debt. So they can use the Fiscal Health Index to guide the debt reduction strategies. And apart from that, the Fiscal Health Index of Niti Aayog is also linked to the incentives provided by the central government to the respective states. So therefore, it can be tied to the conditional borrowing limits or performance-based grants given by the center to the state governments. And in the conclusion, you have to mention that how the Fiscal Health Index fosters transparency, accountability and fiscal discipline, fiscal prudence among Indian states. And in fact, it further strengthens evidence-based governance, it promotes sustainable and responsible fiscal management, and it is essential and important for long-term economic stability and competitive federalism among the states. So this is how you have to write this answer, and I hope you have understood all the components of this answer. And that's all in this session, and thank you so much. Please subscribe our YouTube channel and also hit like.